Material for the brain. Conversations for thinking bodies. In this show, together with our guests, we explore different ways in which we can develop a meaningful relationship with our bodies and minds and respond to the current state of the culture in a quest for more integrated and embodied perspectives. Hello and welcome to another episode of Material for the Brain podcast. I'm coming back after the summer break, and this episode is marking the 4th year that I've been doing this podcast. And before we start with today's solo episode, I want to kind of do a quick house checking and kind of share some updates with you, the listeners of this podcast. As you might know, if you've been following the podcast from its creation, I started this project with the wish to develop more discourse around embodied practices and to invite people who are dedicating their lives and practices to understanding the body, and from that to develop conversation that, let's say, includes more embodied perspectives. And now that we are entering the 4th year, I feel like with changes that are happening in my life as well, that I want to kind of expand a bit the boundaries of what I'm including in the podcast, and to bring people who are not necessarily rooted in that kind of practices. And with the time I've been doing the podcast, I had the feeling that because my practice is very much rooted in developing a connection to my body and seeing the world through that perspective, I think that this kind of serves enough as an anchor for conversation. And I want to open up the possibility to invite people who are also working in other fields in order to enrich the potential conversation that we are having on the podcast. So this is what you can expect from Material for the Brain for the next season. And with that being said, let's jump into today's solo episode. So we are today, I'm recording it, it's the 18th of September, and we are soon about to mark 1 year of the events of October 7th that have changed radically my life, the life of any Israeli person and Jewish person that I know, and the lives of any Palestinian person I know. And I guess also any Israeli and Palestinian person I don't know. And I quite recently got some comments on a video that I posted on my YouTube channel that I'm also sharing the podcast there. And the comments were referring to a video that I shared around a year ago about the topic of criticism of the state of Israel and antisemitism. And I thought that today, since we are kind of marking a year from that events and these thoughts that I shared with you in the past, but the topic have just became more and more significant and important, I thought to dedicate some time for this question and to dive deeper and to respond to some extent to the discourse that I see very present around me in the dance field and elsewhere. And I would say that the main question that we would kind of dive into today is, can one be an anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? The title of the video that I shared 1 year ago was, can one criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic? Which the answer for this, of course, is yes. But today I want to dive into a more complicated ground, because I realized that in this video that I've shared, I did talk about some of the things that I will talk today, but I didn't do such a good job in breaking it down. And I feel it kind of a year, now that a year have passed, I've developed a better ability to articulate myself around this topic and to share it with you. And whether you ask, like, why am I doing it? So I would say that, like, for me, this year has been a tough year of discovering, like, to which extent anti-Semitic is prevalent, and also to which extent it's prevalent within the dance, the contemporary dance scene. And that's my way to respond to that. And I hope that you would find value in it. And no matter what is your political position and what you think about the current war, and I hope that it can inspire you to develop a more, let's say, high resolution thinking about any of those topics. So let's start to dive into this question. Can one be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? That's something that very often when I had conversation in social media, mainly in the last year, and again, I'm an Israeli, I'm a Jew, so I have, let's say, a relatively sensitive radar towards anti-Semitism because it's something that affects me directly. In many conversation, I had moments that I would point out to the person I'm conversing with, hey, I have the feeling that you might start slipping into anti-Semitic grounds. And very often, the answer that I will get back is like something like, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. And I think that for many people, that's kind of a very clear distinction. Many people, especially people on the left, can stand on those grounds and say, yes, I'm not anti-Semitic, I have no problem with Jews, I'm simply anti-Zionist, which in and of itself seems like a logical claim, but I want to break it down because I think that the answer is no. And I will try to do a good job in that, and hopefully I will learn and you can also learn something, and maybe if I do mistakes along the way, I encourage you to correct me and share some of your thoughts with me via comments, etc. So I think let's start, in order to dissect it, let's start looking at a little bit of what is anti-Semitism, because I think that maybe would kind of lead me to it will be good to cover that in order to have a ground for the discussion. So I'm going to read some definition that I pulled up from the internet. So anti-Semitism is hostility, discrimination, or prejudice specifically against Jews based on their religious, ethnic, or cultural identity. It has a deep historical roots and has manifested in various forms, from social exclusion and stereotype to systemic violence and genocide, as seen in the Holocaust. What differentiates anti-Semitism from other forms of prejudice is a unique mix of religious, racial, and conspiracy-based hostility, where Jews are often portrayed as a malevolent, powerful group controlling world's events, while other forms of prejudice may target people based on race, gender, or religion. Anti-Semitism often blends these elements with unfounded global accusations. So one thing that is kind of very interesting about anti-Semitism, besides that it's being one of the oldest forms of prejudice, because you can find evidence in the Hellenistic period, in the post-Alexander Mokdon Greek Empire, that it keeps mutating throughout the years and getting different expressions. So maybe we can say that during the Hellenistic period, the expression of it was the let's say the discrimination of Jews based on the fact that they refused to accept the Greek gods and partake in Greek customs, which kind of pointed out to their cleanliness, and maybe in those days that was a very common thing to do, to just hate and discriminate anybody that doesn't conform to your power. But the interesting thing with anti-Semitism is that what it kind of maintains along the years with its different mutation is that the Jews are playing kind of an avatar role of embodying the worst thing that the current society is criticizing. So, for example, in the Hellenistic period, the Greek culture have seen as the most developed culture, and the Jews have been accused of being backwards because they refused to adopt the Greek culture, which was the most immoral thing you could do, is resist the this developed and brilliant Greek culture, and the Jews play that role of embodying the worst thing that a person in a society can do, which is refuse the Greek structure. And like this, anti-Semitism keep mutating. For example, in medieval Europe, the Jews were accused being Christ killers. What could have been perceived as a worse crime than actually murdering the Son of God? So Jews embodied the worst kind of sin that could be possible. Then in the 20th century, we have the famous Nazi regime that viewed racial purity as the highest value. And of course, what the Jews were representing, they were representing a parasite that disrupts this racial purity. Same, another example in the 20th century, communism. What was the highest value for the communism is loyalty for the Communist Party and loyalty for the communist vision. And what do the Jews represent? They are accused of being cosmopolitans. They are not truly loyal, and they are aligned with capitalism. So again, they are the embodiment. They are the capitalists who run the world. They are the embodiment of the worst crime that we can have today. And we will talk later about what is the expression of the 21st century, because again, that kind of leads me to the topic of why do I see anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. But that's kind of a certain aspect that we can see the manifestation of anti-Semitism. And so besides the, let's say, this kind of conspiratorial accusations, another thing that is very common is what we Jews call double standards, is the treatment of Jews in a different way that we treat other groups in society. So that could take a form of, social exclusion, systemic exclusion, etc. Now, one thing that has mutated between, let's say, the different forms of anti-Semitism that have taken place in the past and what is happening now, and that's kind of a big shift, is that Jews used to be always discriminated on an individual base. So an individual Jew within the society that they are living would be discriminated. But what happened in the 20th century was the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. And Theodor Herzl, the visionary of the Zionist movement, the guy who had the vision to create a Jewish state, one of his hypotheses was that the reason why Jews are experiencing anti-Semitism is because the fact that there is no Jewish sovereignty. The Jews are living in states. They are trying to blend as much as they can, but while they are blending, they also maintain some aspect of their identity, and therefore they are always eventually being cast as strangers, people who are not belong, and they are becoming a target for these kind of discriminatory policies, etc. So Herzl had the hypothesis that the establishment of the Jewish state will also end anti-Semitism. That the moment Jews will be responsible for their own destiny and they will have a state of their own, they will be welcomed within the big family of nations as another nation state, and there will be no need anymore to discriminate them. They will have a place, they will belong somewhere, and that will be fine. And there is also a certain practical let's say, point about this perspective is that the moment there is no, let's say, political body in a form of a state that represent Jews, then it's much easier to discriminate some Jews in your own country, because there is no, let's say, on a geopolitical level, there is nobody that can represent their interests worldwide. But I mean, it will be quite hard to imagine a situation in which any country in the world will decide to create laws that are discriminating Americans locally in their countries, because of course this will kind of invoke a reaction from the US. And on this kind of geopolitical playing field, the fact that US is a very strong country will demotivate anyone from acting in that manner. Now, Israel, of course, is not such a big player in geopolitics, but nevertheless, it's still quite a strong country, strong economy. It has nuclear power, a very modern army. So then, of course, it plays a role that if some, let's say, crazy neo-Nazi politician gets into power in whatever country, they will have to think twice before they start establishing, let's say, Auschwitz 2.0, because they would have to face the consequence of having a strong opposition coming from a Jewish state and not just from other international players that are not committed to the Jewish cause. So there is a certain practical aspect in the hypothesis of Herzl, but this hypothesis was also, to some extent, or not the hypothesis, but the actual execution of the hypothesis, the creation of the state, also gave birth to the current mutation that suddenly discriminate Jews on a base of collective rights, not on the base of individual rights. And again, this is kind of, if you talk to any anti-Zionist, somebody who defines themselves as anti-Zionist, and you ask the majority of them, not all of them, because some people use this trope just because it's more acceptable and they don't want to say, hey, I'm anti-Semitic. But most anti-Zionists, if you talk to individuals and you ask, what do you think? Should Jews have the same political and social rights in your country of origin? So I would say, like, the majority will say, oh, of course, I'm not against Jews. But then they will advocate for policies that will discriminate Jews based on collective rights. And what are collective rights? The rights for self-determination for the group, for Jews as an identity, as an ethnical, national, religious identity, like any other group that claim and aim for self-determination. So maybe now I also have to zoom a little bit and maybe expand a bit what does Jewish identity stands for, because this is also a bit of a confusing ground. And I will try to break it down in a, let's say, simple manner. So I think Judaism is a multifaceted identity that has different expressions. Some of them are religious, some of them are based on ethnicity, and some of them based on cultural elements. Now, one of the reasons why Judaism is a bit hard to understand in modern terms is because Judaism predates our current understanding of religion. And what do I mean by that? Judaism evolved and developed in the Bronze Age. And since the Bronze Age, it didn't change fundamentally at all. So when we speak about Judaism as an identity, we are going into a time machine into the Bronze Age, in a time in which the idea of separating culture, ethnicity, and religion was not even, this idea didn't exist yet. We didn't have these separations. So if you would belong to a tribe, this tribe will have a culture, and this culture will also have a religion, and it will all be one. And if we kind of come back to the 21st century, so of course now we can have an imagine where I am born in a certain ethnicity, but that doesn't necessarily means that I need to have a certain religious that I'm following. Maybe I'm even a secular person, and I can still have different cultural context that I belong to. So I can be of, let's say, I can be an African descendant from Nigeria that was born in LA. So I'm kind of embedded in American culture, even though ethnically my ancestor comes from Africa, and maybe I am practicing Buddhism. I don't know. So I can have a mix of all these things, and I can play with it. But that's not the case for Jews. Now, what happened for Jews in the diaspora? That's a good question. Like, what happened for like somebody who's an American Jew? So what is so are they American? Are they Jew? Like, what is happening there? So of course, we're not talking about absolute terms, and there is a difference between Israeli culture and American culture and French culture and Austrian culture. But Jewishness has certain cultural, let's say, properties that you can find wherever you go and you start to mix with Jews who have maintained connection to their cultural heritage. Now, there can be the case that somebody was born, in of course, in our current postmodern status quo, there could be an example of anything. So there could be a case of somebody who was born to Jewish parents, and they themselves are considered therefore a Jew, but they are in complete rejection to that kind of identity. They're not interested at all to understand Jewish culture, and they're not interested in anything about that. Maybe they're even anti-Zionist, and they reject that completely, and then they lose the connection to the cultural aspect of Judaism. So maybe they will maintain the ethnical connection because that's kind of more like your genetics. You cannot do much about that. But maybe they completely reject any religious aspect and cultural aspects of the Jewish identity. So that could be the case. And something that we have already have enough evidence, if we care about evidence, is that as long as Jewish sovereignty didn't exist, so before the state of Israel, and beside these two short periods of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel in the biblical times, in the kingdom of David, and then I forget the name of the second king that was in the second Jewish sovereignty period. So while there wasn't Jewish sovereignty, we have gathered enough evidence to see what happens to Jews in the diaspora. So in good days, Jews manage to mingle and be active, contributing part of their respective societies. But in bad days, where politics goes into more extreme expressions, Jews are being reminded of the fact that they are from different ethnical background and that their cultural is different and their religious is different, and then then we get the expressions of anti-Semitism. And again, there is enough evidence to that in history. So if you care about evidence, you would be a bit more hesitant with thinking that as a Jew, you can completely blend in any society and that you would be completely accepted. And it happened also to Jews who did prioritize their national identity over their Jewish identity. So, for example, in Second World War, during the Nazi period, there were many Jews who were very strongly connected with their German identity. They were they fought the First World War in the German trenches. They saw themselves part of this German national identity. But then the political situation became extreme, and then they were reminded of the fact that they are not part of the German body, they are actually parasite, and then they eventually have been executed. So since I do care of history and evidence, I'm quite skeptical about the idea that Jews can assimilate 100% in a country that is not their origin, and that they will be forever safe there. As long as anti-Semitism is kind of a phenomena, and I don't know if we will ever manage to get rid of it, but that's my position. And maybe it's a bit contradictory to my actual choices because I live in Austria. And I must say that prior to the October 7 event, I didn't have such a clear sense of that. Like, I would say that during my times in Austria, I got more and more comfortable here until these thoughts about the fact that I'm Jew and I live in the diaspora, these thoughts were not in my mind. the events of October 7 kind of reminded me, hey, you are a Jew, and whether you like it or not, if shit hits the fan, you might experience the harsh side of it. So that's kind of maybe a little bit understanding Jewish identity. And again, I don't want to dive too deeply, like what are the ethnical properties, what are the religious properties, what are the cultural properties. You can further explore it, or if you're very curious about it, maybe, and you express this curiosity, maybe I will make another episode talking about it. But again, it's not so important. It's just important to understand that this identity is multifaceted, and it's not. It cannot be. Trickled down into one element. It has all these different elements embedded in it. So we talked a little bit about anti-Semitism. We talked a bit about Jewish identity. And I think we maybe need to talk about the anti-Zionism. So what anti-Zionism is standing for, and how what it stands for at the end of the day leads to anti-Semitism, or in my perspective is actually an expression of anti-Semitism. So before we talk about anti-Zionism, let's talk about Zionism. What is Zionism? No? So when I think about diving into this question, and I'm a big fan of ideas. I think that ideas are a great motivator for events. So I like to look at it from the perspective of ideas. And so, of course, Zionism was a political movement. But I'm curious, like, what was the ground from which they operated? And of course, like any other political movement, whatever, nationalism, feminism, whatever. Also, Zionism has many shades and many different interpretations. And when I was confronted with this question of like how to explain what is the essence of Zionism, I was asking myself, what would be the common ground in which all the different threads of Zionism could agree upon? What would be the common ground that you would unify all the different expressions of Zionism? That if we have to say, are we Zionism, yes or no, and what would be the definition that all the streams of Zionism will say yes, then I'm a Zionist, so that it wouldn't oppose any of their ideological presuppositions. And I think I came with kind of a simple definition. Let me just pull it out because I prepared it, but now I cannot find it. Okay, so I cannot find what I wrote. I'll just say it from my brain. So I would say like that the essence of the Zionist ideology is the belief for the right of Jews for self-determination and sovereignty over their ancestral homeland. That's it. That's, in essence, what Zionism is. So Zionism advocates that Jews, like any other people, and as we broke it down from the perspective of Jews themselves, Jews do recognize their identity, and they recognize that their identity has different facets. And since it's based on ethnicity, religion, and culture, like any other ethnical group, Jews deserve or have the rights for self-determination. And where should that play? Where should they have the right? Well, in their ancestral homeland, where their culture were developed. Jewish culture didn't develop in Europe. It didn't develop in Asia. It didn't develop in Africa. It didn't develop in the US. It didn't develop in the Arabic Gulf. It developed on the historical land of Israel, the kingdom of David. No? That's the historical land of the Jews. This is where you can see evidence. If you kind of dig in the land, archaeological evidence, you can dig and see where this culture emerged. So that's kind of what unifies any Zionist ideology. Now, of course, if you take the different, there are different manifestation. There's like super, like ultra nationalist Zionism, and there will be like liberal Zionism, and you could be like ultra religious Zionism. You can have different expression, and then you can start questioning like, okay, what does it mean that Jews have the right to sovereignty? Does this sovereignty means that other people don't have the right to sovereignty over that kind of geographical area? Or what do we mean by their ancestral homeland? Do we mean like the partition, the UN partition 181? Or do we mean like the biblical geography that was controlled by King David? What do we mean by that? So of course, there is a big space for debate, and there is a big space for debate within Zionist advocates. As you can see, the fact that there are many political parties in Israel, and some advocates for, let's say, peaceful resolution with the Palestinian, while other parties advocate for ethnic cleansing. Like some people really believe that, okay, Jews should have the complete control over the entire historical and historical land of Israel. So of course there is a heated debate, but nevertheless, everyone would agree on that basics. Now, anybody that doesn't agree with that basics, then they are not Zionist anymore. So for me, if I'm taking it from that kind of simple definition, then what is anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism, in essence, reject that premise. He said, no, we don't agree that Jews have the right to self-determination over their ancestral homeland. No? And then there are like different grounds that people kind of anchor their anti-Zionist sentiments. So some people would say like they might take some political grounds. They would say like, no, I see that the creation of Israel have led to the oppression and discrimination of Palestinians, and I am pro-Palestinians. So from on a national grounds, I want to oppose Zionism, because then I can bring forward the Palestinian national movement that I'm in support of. So that would be one way that people would anchor their anti-Zionism. Others, and that's actually the most interesting, others will do it on a religious grounds. And you can find it in both extreme Jewish, the ultra-Orthodox Neturei Karta. This is the only maybe anti-Zionism expression that is not anti-Semitic in my point of view, but I would say that they are not actually anti-Zionist. So there is a group called Neturei Karta, and this is something that, on the level of meme wars, I've seen many, people who are kind of advocating anti-Zionist kind of throw kind of a video of, look, some Jews that are also agreeing that Zionism is wrong, and then they put a video of some ultra-Orthodox Jews that are mostly living in the US, and they kind of advocates that Zionism should be dismantled. Now, if you dive into their argument, you would understand that from my definition of Zionism, that this is kind of the essence, they are not against Jewish sovereignty. They're not against the right of Jews for self-determination. They're just against the way we get there. So the Neturei Karta, they look at it from a theological perspective, and they say, look, we humans should not do anything politically to influence the creation and establishment of the Jewish state. The creation of a Jewish state and the rebuild of the Jewish temple should happen through divine intervention. The Messiah should arrive, and through the arrival of the Messiah, God will create the Jewish state. The temple in Jerusalem will rebuild, and Jewish sovereignty will be again celebrated on planet Earth. So they don't oppose it, they just have deep skepticism towards the timing and the means. So they say, look, this is not the time, and that's definitely not the means. You should not do it politically. You should wait, you should pray, you should dedicate your life to the Jewish religion, and then God will come down to earth and will recreate the Jewish state. I don't know what in their vision will happen to the Palestinians, but that's their perspective. So, but they are being used in all these meme wars as like an example of that even Jews can be even the ultra-Orthodox, they can be anti-Zionist. But again, like if you go into the essence of what Zionism means, they are not anti-Zionist. No? They oppose the political expression of 20th century Zionism. Another expression of anti-Zionism that could be rooted in religious or theological grounds is, and this very often ends up in antisemitism, is what you can find in groups like Hamas. So Hamas, out of religious ground, believes that the land of Palestine that have once had had Muslim sovereignty, it was controlled by Muslim powers, and now there is no more Muslim power, there's no control, there is no Muslim state that governs the state of Israel, the land of Palestine, this geographical area. And in the Islamic doctrine, the moment a land has been converted to Islam, it should remain Islamic forever. So if, let's say, I am a Prophet Muhammad, and I've made my prophet or a landlord, depends how you look at history. So Prophet Muhammad goes into his conquering quest, and he conquers a certain amount of land. Part of what they conquered in the Arabian colonization was the geographical land of Israel. And they established the Caliphate. There was a period, there was an Islamic sovereignty there. And then this area was fought back and forth between different forces. Eventually, the British got hold of it, and eventually the Zionist movement managed to bring forth their idea of Jewish sovereignty. There was a war, and then now we end up in a situation that there is a Jewish state that controls this ground. From a theological ground, Hamas reject it because they believe in the Islamic doctrine that the moment a land has been conquered, then there has to be back Muslim sovereignty. Now, something that is also there is a lot of evidence for, let's say, anti-Semitic expression within the Quran. There's certain hadith that really advocates for the murder of Jews. There are also other expressions in Islam that do advocate for religious tolerance, but again, that depends on how you interpret those religious documents. So then very often this kind of resistance to the Zionist entity ends up with the call for Jewish genocide at the same time. So maybe there could be a case that you can say, hey, I don't believe that Jews should be hurt in any way. They should have the right to live there, but there should be just an Islamic caliphate with Islamic laws, and Jews should live as minorities in that kind of geographical area. And maybe then you say, like, look, I have no objection to Jews on an individual level, but since this ground was once Muslim, then it has to stay Muslim. Then there is no moral justification for the creation of the state of Israel. And again, from that kind of religious theological ground, you can object, and that can be another form of anti-Zionism. And another form of anti-Zionism that's kind of what can be found a lot within the kind of left-leaning circles nowadays is this kind of anti-imperialist sentiments. This kind of post-colonial movement, people who are kind of very aware of the legacy of colonialism, and they advocate the resistance to Zionism based on those grounds. So this kind of opposition first needs to have a discourse that proves or that claims that Zionism is an imperialistic expression. It's just another form of Western imperialism. And therefore, out of the fact that we object and we are in opposition to imperialism, then therefore the logical conclusion, we are anti-Zionist because Zionism is simply an expression of the imperial Western project. That's the latest, that's the last stronghold of the imperial West, and we have to dismantle it and free the indigenous population, blah, 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 blah. And there are, of course, some anti-Semitic, pure anti-Semitic grounds that you can stand against Zionism, and that you can believe that Jews are parasites, and then, of course, parasites should not have a state of their own, and blah, blah, blah. But we'll not cover it because, again, we are trying to ask if you can be anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. But if your reason to be anti-Zionist is because you're anti-Semitic, then of course that's already, we answered the question. So we have to break down and look at these three different kind of areas in which we find this expression of anti-Zionism: the political, the religious, and the kind of imperialist grounds, anti-imperialist grounds. So let's start with the political ground, with the nationalist ground. So I would say that like there is a certain inbuilt contradiction there, because if I'm saying I'm anti-Zionist because I'm supporting the national project of the Palestinians, then I have to somehow oppose the nationalist project of the Jews. No, because I have to dismantle that idea, because if I am generally, if fundamentally I am supporting the idea of nationalism, and I believe that that nation state should exist, and I think that people that have a certain common ethnicity should have the right to create create a state based on their ethnicity and expression of their ethnicity, and then therefore express it through, let's say, a nationalist project, then I have to somehow claim that the Jewish nationalist project doesn't have the right to exist, or that it doesn't stand on a strong foundation. And again, I would say like a lot of these kind of expressions you can find a lot within Palestinian population. The political grounds, like they say, hey, this is our land, we have the right to build our state, the Palestinian state, on these lands, and the Jews don't have the right for this land. So then there has to be certain, they have to bridge a certain gap, because again, unless you are explicitly okay with double standards, and then that's again kind of puts you in being anti-Semitic, because that's one of the strongest expression of anti-Semitism. And you can say, look, we or let's say, I believe that Palestinians have the right for to the creation of their national home, but Jews don't have the right, even though the Jews are people with culture and ethnicity and religion. I just believe that they don't have this right. Then you are in the ground of double standards. You apply one thing for Palestinian and another thing for Jews. So then again, that's quite anti-Semitic already. But then you can take another route, and then you can, and that's what many Palestinian scholars have done. And you can say, look, Judaism is a religion. Like, why should we enable the creation of a state for a religion? I mean, there's many countries like France, Italy. They have a Christian majority population, but they don't have a Christian state. So why are we suddenly doing a different exception for the Jewish religion? Like, why should this Jewish religion have a state of its own? Like, since when are we supporting? Since when the nationalist project? Since when people who advocate for nationalism are in favor of this theological states. Like, why should we create state based on a religion? That's not the ground from which we can have the moral right to claim for the creation of a state. Jews are simply the citizens of the different countries that they were born into, and many of them, they came from Europe. So therefore, all these Russian Jews that came in the end of the 19th century, what is called the first Aliyah, they were the first, not really, some people call them settlers, they were refugees, but these were the first refugees who escaped the pogroms of Russia. No, they are Russian citizens, they should go there. They are simply Jewish in religion. Or all the Germans who came, they should go back to Germany. And that's a position that many Palestinians stand on. They say, look, the Jews, they don't belong here. They have the countries that they were born in. Why do we need to welcome all these Europeans who came and create a state based on their religion? So now, why do I think that this is anti-Semitic? In order to push forward this argument, I'm breaking down Judaism into merely a religious identity. And in my perspective, that's anti-Semitic. Why? Because you deprive Jews from the right from the right to define themselves. Now, beside that, you also need to kind of ignore all the evidence that there is, again, archaeological evidence, cultural evidence that is really prevalent for the unity, the cultural unity and ethnical unity of Jews in the diaspora, and the Jews who were in the state of Israel, and the Jews who were elsewhere in the world. So you take the element that fits your argument, that no, Judaism is merely a religion, therefore it doesn't have the right for a national project, because nationalism should not be based on a religious identity. Therefore, this whole project is illegitimate. But again, for me, this ground is illegitimate because, again, you take a group that you don't understand and you deny the group from having the right for self-definition, and from that perspective, self-determination. Again, if you ask any Jews, Judaism is not merely a religion. I would even argue that, again, that the cultural and ethnical element are much stronger. Me, for example, I'm pretty secular. I don't practice the Jewish religion. Maybe you can say that I'm a bit of a traditionalist. I sometimes do some ceremonies for the kids because I think that these ceremonies also have, like, again, it's hard to separate them from the cultural element. Because again, it's such a deep blend, so that when I celebrate Shabbat with my kids, I don't do it from a theological ground that I believe that if we don't do it, it's a sin and it's one of the mitzvahs that we have to do, it's one of the rules. I do it because it has certain cultural elements that I think that are very strong, that are very, and these cultural elements are something that many of us are enjoying them around the world, but they are the result of Jewish culture. So again, this reduction in and of itself is anti-Semitic, and therefore I kind of reject that. I say, okay, look, you can say that you're pro-Palestinian, but that doesn't mean that you should be an anti-Zionist. So it means I'm pro-Palestinian. I want to advocate for the rights of Palestinians for self-determination. But I know that the right for Palestinians for self-determination doesn't exclude the right for Jews, and in our modern days, Israelis, for self-determination. So these two things can coexist. And then from that perspective, we can have all the conversation about the two-state solution, how, more ground, less ground, how do we do it? Then we can talk about the how, but not the question of should it exist or not. So then, if you stand on that ground, I would say that you're both pro-Palestinian and Zionist at the same time, because you acknowledge the right of Jews for self-determination on their ancestral homeland, and you also believe that Palestinians should have the right for self-determination on their homeland. And then you just need to solve the problem, and I'm not saying that it's easy, that their homeland happen to be the same. complicated problem to solve, but that leaves you in a certain ground that is clear from, let's say, anti-Semitism. Okay, we can also talk maybe later in another time, like how you can avoid also depriving Palestinians of their rights, because that can be kind of happen for people who are really pro-Israelis, but that will be for another episode. Now, the religious ground we started to cover. So I think, again, as I said, the expression of the extreme ultra-Orthodox Jews, they are not anti-Zionist in essence. Maybe they say it, maybe they call themselves, but if you look at what it means, then they are not. They just simply advocate for different timing and different grounds. The Islamic expressions are more problematic because they are very much mixed with extreme perspectives, interpretation of the Quran. Again, let's say kind of people who are more moderate Muslims, they might not advocate for this political aspect of Islam, because Islam is a religion that also has a lot of political expression. It's not like most religion that has mainly, let's say, moral grounds that it tries to advocate. Islam also advocates for certain politics. One of them is expansion. If an Islamic ground has been conquered, it needs to stay Islamic forever. So basically, if you just run this time machine and you have enough imperialist attempts, one day the entire globe will be under Islamic unification. That's kind of the political aspiration of Islam. But there are many moderate Muslims that they don't believe. They say, look, I don't need to have the entire globe under Muslim domination. I'm happy that, I don't know, Spain used to be controlled by Muslims. Some territory in Spain was part of an Islamic sovereignty. But I'm fine with that. Now it's Spain. I have no aspiration for that. And that's okay. But those groups that tend to have this more extreme interpretation and saying, no, we should never stop fighting on land that has been conquered by previous Muslim leaders. We should always keep fighting. Normally, or typically, those groups also tend to take the more extreme interpretation of how we should treat the Jews. And again, there are certain hadith. Hadith is like a certain kind of interpretation and stories around Muhammad, the prophet, that advocate for the murderers of the Jew. In particular, there is a hadith called the hadith of the sticks and stones, that there is a clear indication that you should murder the Jew. So again, that's very clearly anti-Semitic. Now we can go into this kind of left-wing opposition. And this is, I would say, what is the most prevalent in the dance world nowadays. There is a certain mixture between this kind of left-wing opposition that is kind of grounded in these anti-imperialist sentiments, and the first one, the political national grounds of the what is very prevalent in the Palestinian population. But let's try to break it down. So what are they saying? Basically, this is where you can hear the following information, or the following context discourse, like something like, yeah, Israel is a settler colonial project that is exploiting and oppressing the indigenous Palestinian population, and therefore it is illegitimate and it stands on a immoral ground and should be completely dismantled. Many of these people will advocate for a one-state solution. So they're not going to say, their conclusion will not be, therefore we should expel all the Jews from the land. They will not say something like this. But they will say like something like, there should be like one state for all the people, one democratic state for all the people who are living. Some of them will say, but I'm okay with the two-state solution. It's a compromise, but I understand that we cannot reverse this imperial movement, but we should at least reverse to, let's say, the 48 borders or whatever. They can have some compromise in there to which they agree. They resist this imperial expression. But again, that's the sentiment. Now, in order to do that, again, you have to do certain, you have to bridge certain gaps. Because in order to come to the conclusion that Israel is a settler colony, you have to look at the Zionist movement as an extension of the Western colonial project. Now, one thing that many people would, I've just had somebody commenting on one of my YouTube channel saying exactly this, saying, yeah, even the Zionists themselves call themselves colonialist. So how can you say that Zionism is not a colonial movement? So it is true that you can find certain voices within the early expression of Zionism, especially a guy called Zev Jabotinsky, which philosophically he was part of what is called the revisionist. And he is let's say, the ground from which the right wing in Israel emerged. So you can say that the Likud party, the party that is being run by Benjamin Netanyahu, prior to this change in the last 10 years that it became a populist party, it used to stand on this ideological ground of Zev Jabotinsky. And he clearly said that we should view the Zionist project as a colonial project. He really used these words. Now I would say like that, in the days of the inception of the Zionist movement, colonialism was not, in the West, wasn't considered as something immoral. That was the norms of those days. They say, okay, that the Western powers look themselves as bringing good into the non-civilized territories. Now, in our post-colonial era, of course, we can see it and we can criticize it. So a guy like Zev Jabotinsky, what he's basically saying is like, since Jews deserve their right for self-determination in their ancestral homeland, the best way to get there is to view our movement and to use the strategies of the Western colonial project. That's how we can get there. So he's saying, like, on the level of how, if we view our movement as a colonial movement, we will manage to do what we want to do. And he's also acknowledging that they will definitely experience resistance from the people who are living right now on the state of Israel, on the what was called back then Palestine. No, it was not a Palestinian state, because there was never a Palestinian state, but the geographical area was called Palestine, which is also an interesting story. You can kind of take this thread hole and learn for yourself how did the area that was used to call Judea got the name Palestina. A hint, it has something to do with the Roman Empire, but you can go and search it for yourself. But nevertheless, that's kind of the perspective of these Zionist leaders. Like, we should use and we should ride on this wave of the colonial project to achieve our national aspirations as Jews, to create our own Jewish state. What Zev Jabotinsky didn't say nor think, now I dare to kind of jump into his internal space, because I don't really know what he thinks, but I'm interpreting from what he wrote. He didn't see himself, and he didn't say that the Zionist movement is a representation, or that the Zionist movement is the latest expression of the colonial project, and we are simply bringing the Western culture into that kind of geography, and that's our role. So they were not viewing themselves as Western colonizers. They view themselves as Jews, as Zionists, that want to use the same tool, the same apparatus as the colonial project that was quite successful in the perspective of the Western power, with establishing actual control over a land, over a territory. Again, most of the Jews who came from, let's say, this area of Russia, Poland, they were refugees. If you would see them, how they arrived to the land, you would say, wow, these are poor refugees. They escaped persecution, having this dream of the establishment of a Jewish state in this kind of ancestral homeland where once there used to be Jewish sovereignty, and they came with that kind of vision. We will go and we build this state because there is no state now. There is just imperial powers. There was the Turkish Empire. It was an imperial power that controlled the land. And the Jews from the Eastern Europe had this vision. These are the first Zionist wave of immigration. They had this vision. We're going to go and build our state of our own in this land that is occupied by this colonial power, this Ottoman Empire. No? They didn't view themselves of, now we are Russian imperialists and we're going to extend Mother Russia in this geographical area. No, they were actually experiencing persecution in Russia. So again, in order to view the Zionist movement in these eyes, you have to really ignore a lot of historical facts. Now, many people say, like, yeah, but the British really supported Zionism. So it was clearly because the British supported it, so it's clearly a colonial project. Okay. So then you can say, yeah, okay, if somebody, and this is a I don't know, it's kind of a weird argument. And I don't know, maybe you can, I don't know, let me think something like, I don't know. If I have a son, if my son would decide that he wants to be vegan, and I'm not vegan, I'm actually quite a carnivore, and my son would say, hey, Dad, I decided I don't want to eat any animal products, nothing. And then I would start cooking for him, and I would be helping him. And every time I cook, I will cook for him a vegan meal, because that's what he wants. And then I will at the same time still keep serving meat to the rest of the family. Then would you say that my son is a vegan or is a carnivore? So the fact that I am supporting his cause doesn't mean that he becomes the extension of my cause. And maybe my cause is to promote carnivorism. I like eating meat. I think it's very healthy. And I want to advocate for the freedom for people to eat meat. So then it means that my son then therefore is a carnivore because I am supporting his effort to become a vegan. No, it doesn't mean that. So the fact that the British Empire, back then it was the British Empire, they view the Zionist cause as something that will align with their interests, their geopolitical interests. They did what's good for Britain. They didn't do what is good for the Arab population, and they didn't do what is good for the Jewish population. They did what was good in their mind for the British Empire, and they view the Zionist movement as a movement that would align itself better with their future aspiration for the region. Therefore, they supported the Zionist movement. At the same time, when their interest stopped being aligned with Jewish interest, especially in the beginning, in the early days of Second World War, the British recognized that, okay, we are about to enter a conflict on a different scale, and we need to be prepared for it. And it's not so good if we will have an Arab revolt in the Middle East while we are trying to fight German fanatics. So they decided, okay, let's forget about what we said to the Zionists and let's erase the Balfour Declaration. They published the White Book that had a lot of restriction on immigration, and they expressed their commitment for the creation of an Arab state on the land of Palestine. And they've managed to convince all the Arab leaders to support them and to fight against the Germans. Okay? So and one can actually advocate that these immigration policies that the British have created have prevented many Jews from escaping Europe, because there were many boats that came and were sent back to Europe. And you can even claim that to some extent these policies were another motivating factor in the genocide that took place in Europe during the Nazi regime. Because again, many of these Jews tried to escape. They were not welcome nor in Britain, nor in Palestine, in like the British mandate over Palestine. They were pushed back and had to go back to their countries. Eventually, they were persecuted, isolated, and murdered by the Nazis. So to say that the British Empire had the best interests of the Jews in mind is, again, like, you have to ignore certain historical fact. It is true that there were moments that they were really, you could say they were pro-Zionist, but there were moments that they were completely against any interest of the Zionist movement. And it came into an escalation that eventually the Zionist movement decided to start an armed revolt against the British Empire in the land of what is now Israel. So again, you have to kind of ignore many, many historical facts in order to say that the Jews were simply an expression of the imperial forces. Another thing that is happening, and that's another problematic perspective, is the whole topic of indigeneity. So in the perspective of this opposition to Zionism based on this anti-imperialist sentiment, there is a certain proclivity to have sympathy for the indigenous population. So you say, like, why am I resisting imperialism? Because it deprived the indigenous population from their culture, from their resource, from their rights for determination. It destroyed their culture, their history, blah, blah, blah. And then this perspective looks at Jews as invaders to the land. Say, hey, the Jews, the Zionist movement, it's not about the Jews, it's the Zionist movement. They are invaders to the land. They come from Europe with all their imperial, backed by all these imperial powers, and they are destroying the indigenous population. So then again, you have to ask yourself, okay, what does it mean to be indigenous to a land? Does being indigenous to a land has an expiration date? That's a good question to ask. Like, how long can someone be indigenous to a land? And I think that that's a very interesting philosophical question to ask. Like, okay, if my ancestors were born, my mother was born in Morocco, and also my grandparents. So am I indigenous? Am I an indigenous Moroccan? I was born in Israel. So to where do I pull my indigenous legacy? Like, where does it pull me? And I don't think that there is a straightforward answer. I think it's quite hard to say, like, yeah, this is the rule. But I would say that, like, if we look at kind of more factual based exploration and not of this subjective feeling, because I feel clearly that I belong to this kind of Jewish tribe. So therefore, I don't feel that Morocco is my indigenous land, even though that my mother and my grandmother, and I don't know how many generations backwards, they lived in Morocco. My father family, they come from Belarus, from White Russia. I don't feel indigenous to White Russia in any way. I feel indigenous to the land of Israel. So again, but this is kind of my subjective feeling. And maybe you can find, different perspective. Maybe you can find Jews who are living in Austria and they feel indigenous to Austria. But if we put feelings aside for a moment, because that's kind of very subjective, and we try to also have a more objective perspective, something that is rooted in, like, facts. If you dig into the land of Israel, and there is so much archaeological evidence, then you see that actually, yes, you find so much Jewish history buried in the land. You find coins from the Kingdom of David, and you find scriptures, and you find buildings, and you just keep digging, and you see more and more of the Jewish history in front of your eyes. Literally, you can go and visit Israel. There's so much archaeological evidence to the fact that there was Jewish culture. That's the source of our civilization, of the Jewish civilization. So therefore, on which grounds do you claim that the indigeneity of the Palestinians should exclude the indigeneity of the Jews. Now, I'm not a person that would make the opposite and say, yeah, Jews are indigenous and Palestinians should go to hell. I don't believe in that. I think that there has been enough generations of people living in this land in order to have a deep connection to the land. Palestinian people are very, very, very connected to the land. It's, first of all, there are many. It used to be like a very strong farming culture. There's like really strong connection to the geography. Now, it's like, so I think that this kind of a sentiment that views Jews as colonizer, it has to attack the idea of indigeneity. It has to say, no, Jews are not indigenous. And quite frankly, I haven't heard any intelligent arguments about that. Some people might say, and this is kind of like, again, because many of these left-leaning, basically, just to say, I'm also left-leaning. So just to say, it's not that when I say those left-leaning, I'm also left-leaning in many cases, but this kind of anti-imperialist, typically left-leaning individuals that are advocating for this, they would often say something like, yeah, this whole Zionist movement, they're like basing their connection to the land of Israel on some book, kind of referring to the Bible, mocking that, how the hell can you build your entire argument for colonizing a land based on some kind of a religious doctrine? Now, you kind of crazy. That's already like saying, like, these Zionists, they're not only crazy colonizer, they're also like religious fanatic. They base it on some kind of a book. Now, of course, that there is a certain, the Bible is not a modern historical document. But again, as I say, if you go and use, let's say, more scientific method to ask the question, has there been a Jewish civilization on this land? Then the answer is, there is too much evidence to say no, there hasn't been. So again, the Zionist movement didn't took its inspiration and out of theological religion. They treat the Bible as a document that points out to the factual relation between the Jewish people and this land. That's why it used to be called Judea. What is now called the West Bank. The West Bank is saying, like, the name of this area it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. But this area, it's a bit like saying, I don't know, my neighborhood is not the Sturmviertel, it's the East Bank of the Donau River. It's the East Bank, let me call it the East Bank. So the West Bank is a geographical area that had a name. It's called Judea. And it's called Judea because it used to be the kingdom of the Jews. And then this name got replaced. Again, I'll give you the hint to go and research by yourself. It was replaced by the Roman Empire after they destroyed the second Jewish, so the Jewish state, second expression of Jewish sovereignty over the land. So basically, again, and so why do I say that these anti-imperialists, they are basically anti-Semitic? Because again, they take the Jewish identity and they completely dismantle it. Say, no, you don't have the right to define yourself. We tell you who you are. You're not you're not a people. You don't have a civilization that you belong to. You don't have a unique culture. You're merely an expression of this imperial project with some theological twist, and therefore you're illegitimate, and we should completely object and dismantle this settler colony. Now, another thing that, so again, for me, this is again an anti-Semitic expression. So we covered kind of these three point of view, like the political grounds, the religious ground, and the anti-imperialist grounds, and they all lead to the same place, which is depriving the Jews from the right for self-determination. Now, one thing that is again interesting, and that's maybe another point to come back to anti-Semitism. If you remember, I told you that one of the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is that the Jews have this role of the avatar that fulfill the worst crime that in any current culture that anti-Semitism is taking place. So again, for the Germans, it was like Jews were a parasite on the pure German body. Like, what could be more sinful than being a parasite on this pure body? Or for the communists, like, Jews were this kind of Western capitalist that wants to enslave the working class. What is the worst crime you can express in the communist regime? You're a greedy capitalist. And now, what is the worst crime in our current 21st postmodern Western society? You're racist, you're imperialist, you're colonizer. That's the worst crime you can do. And what are the Jews, by chance, which role they express? They are this Zionist, and Zionism is racism, Zionism is genocidal, Zionism is colonial, Zionism is imperialism. So again, the Jews, by chance, happen to express the worst kind of crime you can do. Now, again, anti-Zionism is a very subtle thing, and they keep saying, no, we are not against the Jews, we're just against Zionism. Again, but as we broke it down, at the end, it kind of ideologically, it sits on grounds that deprive Jews from their own identity. Now, I think that's kind of, we've quite summarized it. I think it's already quite broken down, but nevertheless, I had a certain analogy to give you, which could be like a nice intellectual exercise in order to think about it. And I thought to talk to imagine and to ask the same question on a different ideological ground. Can you be an anti-feminist without becoming misogynistic? So can there be an anti-feminist movement that doesn't express misogynism? Now, I think if you ask this question, I guess that the majority of you would have an immediate response. No, of course, you cannot be anti-feminist without being misogynist. What do you mean? And basically, that's kind of what the thread that we are talking about. No, can you be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic? For me, it's a very nice intellectual ground. And then again, if I do the same exercise and I think like, okay, what binds all the different expression of feminism, and what is the core belief that no matter if you're like, I don't know, liberal feminism, radical feminism, intersectional feminism, whatever feminist you are, what is the core belief? I would say, like, women as a group deserve equal treatment and opportunity in the society. No, that's kind of the essence. That's what any form of feminism advocates for, like equal treatment and opportunities for women. And now, if you are in opposition, if you say, no, I'm anti-feminist, I'm not for that idea. I don't think that women deserve that kind of equality, equal treatment, opportunity. Can you be anti that statement and not slip into misogynistic ground? No, you cannot. Of course you cannot. Then you can maybe say, look, I am for that, but I don't agree with that kind of perspective that looks at equal, that advocates for equality of outcome. I'm more for the support of equality of opportunity, or maybe I'm critical for this radical feminist expression because although it tries to elevate equal treatment to women in areas where they are not treated equally, it does maintain it doesn't criticize area in which women are being favored. So it's not actually about equality. It's about like female supremacy. You can have this argument, but again, you're not saying I'm against equality for women, and therefore you're not threading into misogynistic ground intellectually. So again, think about the feeling that arises in your body when you hear this sentence. Yeah, I'm anti-feminist, but I'm not against women. Just think about this feeling that comes up. That sounds really awful. And that's the feeling that I get when I hear somebody say, yeah, I'm anti-Zionist, but I'm not against Jews. I get the same feeling, And again, I hope that with this episode, I've managed to enlighten some of the problem with that kind of discourse. And yeah, maybe just to kind of finish it with some comments on the context which this whole conversation is taking place, because I think it will be unfair to completely just throw it in a vacuum. I think what I find very interesting in this kind of spiral of violence that is constantly taking place in the land of Israel, land of Palestine, however you want to call it, since the beginning of the 20th century, is that to some extent, we are both Palestinians and Israelis. We are bound by the same intuition. And the intuition is that being a refugee is something that doesn't have an expiration date. What do I mean by that? So, to some extent, you can say that the entire Zionist movement is based on the notion that we once had sovereignty over our land, and this was our ancestral homeland, and therefore we will always maintain a certain longing to that land, longing to our home. And again, I think that the feeling of home is something very strong in human life, where you feel somewhere, yeah, that's my home. And that's kind of the ground that Zionism is based upon. Hey, we are coming back to our indigenous homeland. And that's something that you hear very often also within Palestinian people. They say, look, we have been expelled in 48. We've been living in Jaffa. We've been living in Haifa. And this is where we feel home. We still have the keys. There's this kind of many, most of the people who were expelled, they're already dead because many years have passed. But their grandchildren, they say, hey, I still have the key for the home of my grandfather in Jaffa. And that's my home. I will never forget it. And I think that one of the difficulty in finding a solution, that the common perspective within Israelis and within Palestinians is a zero-sum game. If it's my home, it's not your home. If it's your home, it's not my home. So then there is a constant zero-sum game that we are fighting. But I feel like that there is the acknowledgement of that kind of very universal phenomena of feeling connection to a certain geography, feeling connection to something that metaphysically represents your home. Home can be many things. I feel at home with my body, but I also feel at home when I walk in the hills of Jerusalem. So I think that this kind of starting point, if I'm really in my whole heart, I want to advocate for a more peaceful future, maybe I can start within myself to recognize that what is so dear to me, this feeling of home, is also very dear to the person who stands in a complete opposition to me politically. And maybe you are not Israeli, you, the audience, or maybe you're not Palestinian, so you just advocate it from, you're just involved from afar, but maybe you can kind of go deep into your own feeling of what does it feel for you that you have a certain place in the world that you can call home. And remember that both Israelis and both Palestinians has this feeling towards this little piece of land. And when we start acknowledging it, bottom up as people, maybe we can start to respect each other more and hopefully move away from military solution that aims for total victory, that aims for zero-sum game winners takes it all solution, because I think that as long as we are stuck in that paradigm, unfortunately, violence will prevail. And that critique is being offered equally to both Palestinians and Israelis alike, because I think that's a very, very common way of thinking. And in that regard, I would be cast as a radical leftist in Israel by kind of advocating for it. But that's my position. And I hope you enjoyed and learned something. And again, if you think that I've made any error, please, I will really appreciate if you write me, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, or if you listen it on Spotify. There's also a place to leave some comments and questions on Spotify nowadays, or send me an email or whatever form. I will respect if you avoid slurs and shouting that I'm a genocide enabler and all this kind of nonsense, but actually treat the arguments and thoughts that I brought forward so that we can keep the conversation going. And with that, I wish you a beautiful day and see you on the next episode of Material for the Brain. If you want to see more precious and insightful moments, make sure to check our short clips playlist. To see longer interviews, check out the full episode playlist just below it. And to be notified for all future videos, click the subscribe button and don't forget to hit the notification bell. See you on the next episode.